Everyone, welcome to this adult fantasy sequels panel August edition. I'm getting super creative with the names. I've kind of just run out of steam thinking about names for them. So sorry for like every other panel, right, for the rest of 2023. I am so happy to be talking about some of my most anticipated sequels of this year and also next year. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me if you don't know who I am, and then the authors will introduce themselves and talk about their books, and then we'll talk about my questions. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and I will remember, hopefully, to come back and bring them up at the end of the chat as well. If you don't know who I am, my name's Lily. I'm the book like person, I guess, behind Utopia State of Mind, basically all over the internet. And that's all that you really need to know. So we'll have our authors introduce themselves, starting with Shelley.
Hello, I'm Shelley Parker-Chan, and my new book is He Who Drowned the World, which is the second in a duology. So it is the end of the series. People always ask me if it's a trilogy, but no. If you know book one, you know that people did a lot of terrible things. So this is coming to terms with the terrible things that we have done.
They have fucked around and now they're finding out. Perfect duology structure, honestly. Hello, my name is Tara Sim. I am a young adult and adult fantasy writer. Latest series is The Dark Gods, the second book of which, The Midnight Kingdom, comes out this month. Basically, it's about, wouldn't you know it, gods that are dark and awful, and their descendants who are also kind of awful, but trying not to be awful. So they do some questionable things, but you know, that's just how it is.
It's complicated. Hi everyone, my name is Chelsea Abdullah. I am the author of the Sandsea trilogy. The Stardust Thief is the first book. The second book, The Ashfire King, is slated for next year. The first book in the trilogy follows a merchant, a prince, a djinn, and a thief on their adventures through desert to look for this mythical magic lamp. Shenanigans ensue. There's a lot of political scheming, lots of banter, and a lot of unexpected or maybe expected danger along the way as well. So the Ashfire King is the second book in that series, sort of continuing to follow these characters on their journey. But the stakes are quite a bit higher.
Yeah, I love that segue too, because I think it's something that you and both Tara have said, right, about the stakes in second books and like what happens, the consequences that you have to kind of realize that are actually real in second books. So that's certainly something that I wanted to start off with chatting about here, which is talking about the challenges, but also the unexpected joys, hopefully, of writing sequels, and also for I just merged your names together by accident. For Shelley and Chelsea, since these are also your sophomore books, could you also maybe talk about how this process could have, this process was specifically because, it's like the second of them. So Shelley, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, no, second books are a nightmare, which Tara no doubt knows already. Yeah, pandemic second books, also not the most fun time. But there were some very fun things about writing a second book, which is when you get to bring your characters together from different storylines. You know, you've been building it up throughout like the first book, and then finally like your big bads meet, or your protagonists from different sides of the story meet for the first time. And you can discover parallels between them that you can start to really play with to build up contrast and irony. I was always discovering new things about my characters, so I thought that was really fun. But most of the time I was just crying. I was sitting in my writing cupboard crying, being like, this is really hard and I hate it. But by the end, I was happy to have done it.
Crying is a big part of writing book too. So
I was about to say that's where I am.
Yeah. I think when I turned it into my lovely editor, I was like, I wrote this in a fugue state. I'm sorry if it makes no sense at all. And then somehow she came back to me. She's like, I don't know what you're talking about. This is great. And I was like, I don't believe you, but okay. Literal fugue state. I don't even remember writing half of it. Yeah, I'd say like for my specific book too, with this specific series, there was definitely a challenge in having the characters be split up. Um, and so a lot of the time I couldn't write in a linear fashion, which is what I typically like to do. Like I don't like jump around like a lot of authors do. Um, so like writing everybody being so separate, it was just like, like I kind of had to like group them up into different pairings so that I it was kind of linear, but also like everyone was, I don't know. It was, I tried to erase it from my mind.
I know it's once it's passed, you're like, it was a traumatizing experience. I don't want to remember it. As someone who is still in the middle of editing my sequel, I do not yet have the ability to block it from my mind. Um, but I'd say so for me, because this is my first book on deadline, that's been the hardest thing for me. I think in general, when people think of writing on deadline, the stressful part of writing on deadline is turning in the book at a specific time, which, yes, that part has been stressful. But I think for me, it's more just the mindset. Like writing on deadline feels very different. Even like it's affected my whole creative process. I am a pantser and I'm an overwriter, which those two things together are not great on deadline. Right, you know how it is. So usually, typically, I like to spend a lot of time in my world. I like to sort of like sink my teeth in and just spend a lot of time there. Even if I'm able to extend my deadlines, which I've had to do because this book has been really difficult. Um, it still plays with your mind. This idea of, oh well, I still need to turn in a product. It still needs to be good. People are expecting good things from me. So that expectation, I think, comes into your head a lot earlier in the process. And it's an incredible thing because people expect that you can do good things, but it's a lot of pressure, and that I think affects, at least for me, it has greatly affected my drafting process. But in terms of unexpected joys, I think for me, being able to expand on my side characters. I mean, in general, I'm a character person. I really love, writing character arcs, spending time with my characters. My stories are always about, characters first. But in this book, I've been able to shine a spotlight on some of the side characters who didn't get as much of a spotlight in book one. And that has been really, really fun.
I feel like you're just doing my job for me with all these segues to future questions. That was another question that I wanted to talk about, because I do think that side characters in sequels as well can often get a little bit more time to shine or a little bit more attention to them. So I wanted to ask all of you kind of, who is your favorite side character that you got to spend more time with in this sequel? Do you want to just start because you led us so well into that question?
Because I'm obviously so very excited about this. Um, yes. So there are actually multiple side characters, some of whom are new, and I'm really excited for people to meet. There's one character who I think I describe as having the temperament of a storm. She's just extremely chaotic, extremely selfish, but also a really nuanced character. So I'm very excited about her. She's brand new. In terms of characters who appeared in book one, there's a character who's introduced very late in book one, who I didn't really get the opportunity to delve into, but who is a pretty major character in book two. And I absolutely love their dialogue. They're just so snappy and so just have such a big personality. So I've been excited to write them. And then finally, there is a I want to avoid spoilers. Um, there is a character who appears early in book one, who is someone's sibling, who appears more in book two and gets more page time. Who I also love dearly.
Suppose I can go. My whole sequel is titled after a side character from the first one. So the he in the title is actually a guy who just sauntered on the screen in the first book, said a bunch of insults, kind of stole the show, and then sauntered off. But So I guess you get to indulge yourself in the second book. I really wanted to look at the idea of men not as a homogenous group. So I have a lot of queer people in my book, and some of them are men, and some of them are straight men. And in fact, the protagonist, or one of the main characters of this second book, is a straight man, but he's super effeminate, and the world craps on him in a very specific way. So I really wanted to have a diversity of characters. So I do have a non-binary person and a trans person and a woman and also a very effeminate man. And because you get 4 of them, you get to see how gender affects their lives in very different ways. But my agent had told me to cut out all his points of view in the first book because she was like, "Oh, it's just kind of self-indulgent. You're having too much fun." So he didn't get a point of view in the first book, but in the second, I really got to delve inside his head. And so far, results have been like, some people are like, "This is the most villainous character I've ever met in my entire life." I'm like, I thought he was really relatable. But so there you go.
That's so funny. I feel like I kind of get something similar with another character of mine where some people are just like, "Oh, she's so like immature and whatever," and I'm like, "I think she's fucking great." And
Right.
maybe shares some traits with me, but it's not personal or anything. I'm kind of in the same, boat with Chelsea, where there are some people from book 1 coming back for book 2 that we get to explore a little bit more. Primarily the younger siblings of the heirs. So that was very fun to get to explore them, especially the relationship between Angelica and her stepsister, because that was a very fraught relationship with them in book 1. And I wanted to really make sure that that was like a key relationship to Angelica's arc in book 2. So that was very fun. But there's a whole plethora of new side characters in book 2 that I am so excited for people to meet. There's a talking decapitated head, whom I love very much. Again, I can see people being like, "This guy fucking sucks," but I love him. I think he's great.
I'm already very excited about this.
Yeah, what's not to love?
I can tell that my editor was like, "Why did she do this?" But again, it's the self-indulgent thing. Like, why not have a decapitated head? There's some people in other realms that we get to meet, so you get to see a little bit more of the world building through their not POV, but just through how they interact with the main characters and stuff like that. So yeah, I had a whale of a time writing all of the various secondary characters in book 2.
Okay, I'm selfishly skipping to my favorite question. I was at an event of Chloe Gong, and Chloe referenced this quote from someone else. So Chloe didn't say this, but she referenced it from someone else. But it was that a hero will sacrifice the person they love to save the world, but a villain will sacrifice the world to save the person they love. And so I think it's by Renee Rocco. But I wanted to know, just because that's one of those things that I've heard that has kind of just stuck with me ever since I heard that. And so I wanted to know what you all think that your characters would make of that quote in the context of their sequel, their journey, their character arc. And do you think that they would label themselves as heroes, villains, neither? What are their feels about about this quote? Tara, do you want to start?
I feel like this is a very difficult question for me because so many of my characters are in that weird gray area. And there are a couple of them, especially Tasia in book 2, who has this very specific arc of hero, villain. I don't want to be either of these things, but I have to be one of them, apparently. And it's funny because without being super spoilery or anything, a big resolution in book 2 is actually kind of a riff on that quote. So it kind of flips it a little bit. So I'm excited for people to see how that plays out. It really just varies on the POV character, honestly. I think some of them really want to be heroes and they're just too harsh on themselves to consider themselves as heroes. Like they think they're too cowardly or like they haven't like done the right thing. So therefore, how can they possibly be heroes? Or, like someone who very much wanted to be a villain has too much of a moral compass to actually be a villain. So kind of like playing with these tropes is one of my favorite things to do in this series. And just because everyone is like, even the lawful good people in this world are pretty morally gray. So it's been really interesting to kind of see how that evolves throughout the series.
I don't think I have any lawfully good people in my book. Yeah, it was a really interesting quote. I thought about it for a bit. I think a lot of my characters think of themselves explicitly as villains, and they are acting the role of villain, perhaps because that role is put upon them. They didn't necessarily choose it, but everyone said, you look like a villain, and we disagree with the way you present yourself in the world. You're having this role of queer villainy thrust upon you, and the characters struggled with it. And at the end, he said, you know what, screw you all. I am going to be the queer villain, and I'm going to ruin you. But I think his arc is very much, so no one in this book wants to save the world, literally no one. And the title character in particular wants to destroy the world to hurt the people who hurt him. So it's very much hurt people, hurt other people in turn. Even the characters who maybe don't think of themselves explicitly as villains, are quite happy to kill even the people they love to achieve what they want to achieve. So yeah, there's not a lot of world saving going around in this book, maybe world winning, but then in the process of winning, do we destroy it all kind of thing. But even the most villainous of my characters, I think have a bit of heroism to them. And I know some people may not feel like anything can overcome murder and torture and all the rest, but the courage to be themselves is actually quite heroic, I think, especially when the world is telling you, just shut up and die. God, like you're making everyone's life really difficult here. And also we don't want to look at you, because you're wrong in our worldview. To stand up and say, you know what, I'm going to be here and I'm going to make you look at me and witness me. And I think that's heroic in a way. But yeah, there's a lot of world burning down happening in my book.
I love that term, world winning. That's so great. Yeah, no, I think for me, most my characters are just trying to survive. I think so often, and this is something that this series I think plays with, is the idea of, how these characters see themselves versus how other people would see them. And sort of like, the titles that are put on them and the expectations that are put on them, that they themselves, do not want to shoulder. Um, and I think, when I think about like hero, like, hero versus villain, those are both terms that my characters would just kind of not, they wouldn't associate with either of those things. I think they kind of fall into that middle in between space. Because again, like they're trying to survive, so they do whatever it is they must to survive. And when sacrifice comes into play, it's super interesting because I think even the most heroic of my characters, even like, there's one character in particular who has a very, a good heart, and wants the world to be a better place, and wants to save everyone, that is important to him. um, but I also don't know if he would sacrifice anyone that was important to him in order to save the world. And that begs the question, like, does that make that character selfish? What does it mean to be a hero? Like, is it possible to be completely selfless and be a hero? And like, is that completely unrealistic? Because I think, the ideas that people have of what constitutes a hero, we often think selfless characters who will do anything for the greater good. But if you're sacrificing someone, if someone needs to die in order for that to happen, then are you still a hero in that person's eyes? So like it depends on really who's hearing the story of the person. It depends on, the people that are being sacrificed, versus the people that are being saved. Because at the end of the day, like, is it possible to even in the case of world saving, is it possible to save the world and be a hero in everyone's eyes? And I don't think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, and I think that's also like one of those questions or one of those like themes that so much literature kind of grapples with, right? How you survive at the end, um, and the expectations and what people like perceive your survival meaning at the end, whether they paint you as like one thing or the other. Um, I have a few questions that kind of delve a little bit into each book. Sorry, excuse me. So I'm going to start with Tara. So Tara, you have a lot going on the Midnight Kingdom. Specifically, I was referencing the fact that they do kind of splinter off and go in different directions. And that was what I was thinking about when I was writing this question. So how do you keep track of and balance sort of what's happening for each person, who they're with, what they're doing, like where they are even in the world? And how their stories interact. And so because of that was like that element in terms of plotting harder than for the City of Dusk.
Yes. Like, at least in book one, they were all in the same place for the majority of for the whole book. And in this one, they are splintered off for the majority of the book, in different realms even. And so I had to do a lot of world building, not just for an entirely different realm, but also an entirely different empire in their home realm. So there was just a lot of brainstorming and world building that I had to do before I could even think about starting the book. A lot of character arc work that I had to do beforehand, and kind of like mapping out where they would be, what the timeline was going to be. Timelines was very difficult. I think I even threw a line in there just to cover my ass, to be like, time moved differently in this realm. There's 2 new realms that I had to do world building for. I forgot about one. Like I said, my brain is just trying to erase the whole memory of drafting this book. But it was pretty difficult, especially when it came to drafting. Like, I think that there is a joy in world building and in like the pre-drafting period, where you can be like, here are all these brilliant ideas that I have. And then when you actually get to drafting, you're like, oh no, I have to execute them. I don't like that. They're safer up here. And so I mentioned before that this was like the first, if not the only book that I did not write in a linear way. And that's because I realized, I think halfway through Act 1, and each book is divided into 4 acts, that I couldn't keep going between characters for each chapter. I had to write all of a character's arc for one part of the act before I could go on to a different group of characters. And then when I finished the act, I had to go through and kind of knit them all together in a certain way, which involved me and my editor later being like, actually, I think this chapter should go here, or like these should be flipped. And then if that kind of changes the timeline, so then this should happen here. So there's a little bit of that in the revision. But like overall, that way of writing book 2 was a lifesaver. I think it would have taken me a year to write otherwise. But yeah, it was pretty difficult, but also like very rewarding, because I feel like I got to cover so much ground world building wise in this literal universe that I've created of these multiple realms. So I feel pretty proud of the end result.
Yeah, and I think that it kind of splinters off, into like almost like a sun ray, for this one, where there are just so many different things, and you've put so much of the world in like relief and contrast to like other places of the world, but also what people's perception was before like they got to where they are.
Yeah.
So I guess what else to say.
I get you put down.
Yeah. So for Shelley, so He Who Drowned the World and also She Who Became the Sun kind of talks about this line between history and fiction, not only within like, our world history and fiction, but also I think within the books as well, talking about stories about who they, who each of them are. So I wanted to know if you could talk about if your opinions or experiences change while writing He Who Drowned the World, versus the first one. And I also wanted to know if there were any like specific rabbit holes in terms of research or just things that like you could not sort of stop thinking about.
Yeah, I guess it has always been a series that is in conversation with the real history. So even though I knew that most people wouldn't come into the series knowing about this emperor specifically, I think it was important that people had a vague understanding that the historical figure was a man, um, and that he probably did a lot of horrible things and became a tyrant. And the second book in particular, because it goes in a very different direction to history, I feel like that tension is increased. The characters have a lot of inflection points where you see where they could have made the decision, I think, to go down the path of real history, but I wanted to create an alternative, or at least like bring that vision into being. How could our world have been different if people had made some different choices in the 14th century, if queer people had gotten to be themselves in the 14th century and created a world that was, more inclusive. How nice to imagine. I wish it were the case. So that's sort of hovering over the whole duology. But it does, the compression of the timeline of history is much more marked in this book. There's just no way I could have written it according to the real timeline, which was like 20, 30 years. Like, God, who wants to watch a war drag on for 30 years, which is how it always happens in reality. So this is like literally this book happens in a year. Like, we're just going to compress and have the fun parts only of history. The one big central battle, none of them mopping up. And I have inserted some extra emperors into the timeline just for shits and giggles because I thought that was fun. We do know how the book ends, so I think I had to make it more amusing along the way with a few unexpected twists and turns. So in that respect, it was actually good because I didn't have to do as much research, which is also good because I wrote this book during the pandemic, and there's one book in the university library that covered the ship battle that I had to write in this book because it's a key point in the history, and it's kind of obscure. And it's only this one book, and it's not digitized, and it only exists in one copy, and the library was shut for 2 years because of the pandemic, and it was just a pain in the butt. So I wrote it at the very last minute, basically during proofs. You know how you have your typeset pages and you're not supposed to change anything in your typeset pages? And then I basically rewrote an entire scene on the typeset pages, and my publisher was like, please do not do this. Yeah. But apart from that, I didn't have to do too much research. It was more books on anxiety and books on trauma and books on grief and insomnia and all that juicy psychological fun stuff that the book's actually about, not the battles.
Yeah, because as I was reading this question and like thinking about, I've sent the questions a bit ago, but I've been still like thinking about them basically ever since I sent them. And yours specifically, I was also thinking about how like the characters have, and I think a lot of, characters have these like stories about themselves that are presented to other people, legends, history, facts, like all of this kind of murky in between that have all of these layers of interpretation. And I think it is such a central theme as well that is in specifically also He Who Drowned the World, right? Like what is it? Like, not like sort of when you meet like the person behind the mask, right? Or if you meet like any sort of thing where like two expectations or two sort of stories, I guess, are like really clashing. And I felt like when I was writing this question and when I was thinking about it, history and fiction and stuff, I think made me think of kind of those themes in other ways also within your books. So for Chelsea, one of the things I loved about The Stardust Thief were the interludes. Also, I kind of just love interludes in general. So I wanted to know if we could expect more interludes like that in The Ashfire King, and also sort of the process you have when constructing those in terms of sort of, if you're just kind of writing, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, it would be really cool if there was like an interlude here that would save me like 5 pages of world building in the future or something.
I love it when that happens. Yes, there will be more interludes in the second book. They are also one of my favorite things to write, so I'm excited to share more of them. I'd say my process for interludes in this book, because the interludes are usually inserted into the story, they are a story that is told by another character. Because one of the biggest things about this trilogy in general is that it's a love letter to storytelling, specifically to oral storytelling. So that is and continues to be a very big theme in the book. But I'd say in book one, I kind of had more, I don't want to say more ideas of the stories themselves because everything kind of unfolds as I write because I'm a pantser. But there were definitely some stories that I felt were very central. Like there's a story um, that's called A Mirror and the Lamp in the first book. And I knew that there was going to be a story about the lamp because that was a very big plot point. This book, there's a lot of lore, a lot of magical lore. And so I have written so many interludes and scrapped so many interludes, a lot of which I feel like the stories themselves are very, very interesting, but they just don't fit in the narrative as a story. Some of these stories I find myself going, no, this is something that needs to be told in summary over 3 lines. We don't need the whole backstory of this very specific character. As much as I would love to share it, it exists. So maybe someday I will. But yeah, no, I'd say for this book especially, just because there is so much magical lore and because the world is expanding in such a different way. And I mean, this always happens with sequels. You're always expanding on the lore that already exists. Um, but in this book, I want to say the nature of the world building is also very different, because you're seeing a different side of the world. So the stories that are told in that world are quite different as well. So I've written so many interludes, and kind of been swapping them in and out, based on what feels natural for the story. So the interludes themselves are a lot of fun, but then I constantly have to ask myself the question, should this be a story? Would someone tell this as a story, or is this better told um, in 3 lines of summary? Which for me is always a very big question because I'm an overwriter and I like to put all of my lore down on the page. And then I have to trim it down a lot during edits.
Well, I'm looking forward to them. Both the ones that made it in and the ones that didn't make it in. I'm intrigued about both. Um, I want to switch over to some of the audience questions, mostly because like a few kind of were things that I also wanted to know, and like I've sort of written them in some various form, like in our actual questions. One of them was, how do you nail the voices of characters, right? And I think, and specifically in sequels, it's nice to have a little bit more space to kind of explore that. I'm going to start with Tara because you have a bunch of characters.
I like how that was like borderline accusatory, which I'm honestly used to at this point. I have 7 POVs in this series, which is frankly, it used to be 8, dropped it down to 7. Yeah, this question is kind of odd for how I write specifically because I feel like when it comes to character voices, I will get like an image of them in my head, and included in that image is some sort of like personality flair of them. So like for example, when I picture Angelica, I see her like scowling and I'm like, this is the voice. Or when I see Tasia, she's like, and so she kind of has more of like a cheeky vibe to it. And then Nick, he's very sad, so a little bit more morose, that kind of thing. Risha, very like duty bound, so a little bit more like Taurus earth-based type of. And so like I feel like that's usually my entry point into getting voices. And I know that's probably kind of a weird way to do it, but a lot of it, like what Chelsea said, I'm also a pantser for sure. I kind of do like a both plotting and pantsing. So like I at least know what the big markers of the story are, but a lot of things and a lot of connections don't come to me until I'm actually drafting it. And so like sometimes a lot of character choices won't come to me until I'm like actually immersed in their voice. And then I'm like, oh, you wouldn't choose to do what I had you choosing to do. You would actually choose the opposite thing. Got it. And so kind of like figuring out who they are as I go is also a big component of it. But I typically start with that one little image of them frowning or grinning or like in some sort of action, like someone's running away or something like that. And I'm like, okay, hectic, that, cheerful, that, and then I just kind of go off from there.
No, I want to say I'm actually the same way. I'm a very visual writer, and so when I first envision my stories, I usually will see like an image of my character with a certain expression on their face, and that usually carries out throughout, I think, the whole series.
I think you and I are just very similar drafters.
We have a very similar process.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so I definitely feel that way. One thing about voice and characters for me, so I always tell people this, my characters are their most dramatic selves in the first draft. Everything is, very very soap opera-ish, like the characters overreact to everything. The way I see it, it's kind of like, it's, they're exhibiting, how they would react to something based on their personality, but almost like the extremes of that personality. So, if you have a character who's very grumpy, then in the first draft they are grumpy about everything. And then one thing that I do during edits, because I have so many beats, so many plot beats, so the characters are reacting to all these things in the first draft. I edit a lot for voice. So because the characters are so dramatic, they kind of wear their heart on their sleeves almost for me in their first draft. And then I can go back and tone them down. Now that it's sort of like, now that I know what the ending is, now that I know where the character is going to be at the end of the story, I can kind of temper their reactions to things earlier in the story. So for me, I think so much of voice, I mean, the voice just kind of comes from the characters and it's over the top in my early drafts. But it's not really until I've written out the character arcs, that I can kind of get a full sense of how they would react to something beat by beat. Especially because I'm thinking about pacing. I don't think about pacing in my first drafts. Things just happen. And then I get to my second draft, and because I know where the ending is, I can better pace out the reactions that my characters are making. If I know that certain emotions are going to be building in them, I can go back and make those emotions a little bit more moderate in the beginning, have them build up. So for me, even though I love characters and I love character voice, and my characters are very voicey, I feel like I figure them out a lot in dialogue, which is why I really like banter. Very often, I will get a sense of who the character is based on how they interact with other people. So that's how I figured them out in the first drafts. And this is also the case in the sequels. Like I know who they are. I have that key character figured out from book one, but then I'm also figuring out still how they're going to evolve, and a lot of that is dependent on still how they're reacting to new characters, how their opinions are changing based on new information that's given to them in the story. So even though those hints are there in my first draft, I have to edit heavily, once I know what the pacing is, once I know where they end emotionally, by the end of the book.
I like how you said you edit out the melodrama of your characters, because I'm kind of the opposite. I'm like, more melodrama. Recently, a lot of people have been like, oh, you write grimdark. I'm like, I don't write grimdark. I write emo fantasy. Everyone's like got their hearts on their sleeves, and it's like that feeling the most it's possible to feel about everything all the time. And yeah, maybe it's a bit much, but I love it. I love wallowing in the emotions. But I don't think I'm a very voicey writer, even though the first layer of a draft that I write is entirely dialogue. So it looks like a screenplay when I write it. But it's probably not my strength. I like to start off with archetypes, which I guess is a little bit like you guys have that initial flash of like a image attached with a little like sense of who they are. So it's a bit like that. But then I also label specific things. Like some people will speak more formally, which sort of reflects their mindset. And then some people, even though it's set in the 14th century, they'll have quite a modern way of speaking just to break things up and to give a bit of their personality as maybe more playful. Not that anyone's that playful in the second book. It's all doom and gloom, but some people are a little bit more sardonic about their doom and gloom, and some people are just really like angst monsters. But my character's not fixed from the time I start even a second book. Well, their personalities are pretty distinct, but the way they understand themselves is always changing in all my drafts. It's quite an iterative process because I have to thread a character through the fixed points of the plot, because my plot is more a fixed framework maybe than some other people's, because it's based on history. So certain things have to happen at certain points. But then also the theme threads through that, and you have to find a version of a character that will hit all the beats at exactly the right points to move the plot and the theme simultaneously forward, which I always find a challenge. So I went through like 20 versions of these characters. There's specific ways they understood themselves. Like in some versions, they'd be really repressed and they weren't thinking about, what they'd done. In other versions, they thought about it all the time. And I had to find solutions for these 4 different POVs. It was like solving a Rubik's Cube, which I guess is the joys of iterative writing. You come closer and closer to a solution, but it's always quite frustrating because there's always something you can't solve. You've got there too many moving points, like plot, theme, character, and you've got to solve them all for every single point of the book. Yeah, I don't know, got 95% of the way there. Consider it done.
I always look at it as like a triangle of like plot, character, world, and I I feel like with most books, like 2 shine and then a third isn't quite like as polished as the other 2. I feel like this is across like most books, which isn't to say that like one of them is bad. It's just that an author will focus on like 1 or 2 of those things, but kind of rarely do you get like the perfect trifecta of stuff. And I definitely think my plot fails a little bit because I try to earn so much in character arc and world building, but I'm like, that's a hit I can take. I don't care.
You gotta pick your strength as well.
Pick your battles.
we got another question as well in the chat, which was, how do you prevent the ending of a sequel from feeling rushed? I thought that I would start off with you, Shelley, since yours is like the only duology here as well. So maybe the question is even harder. How you stop like the ending of the thing from feeling rushed.
I might not be the best person to ask about this because my such are the joys of publishing. You don't know how long the series is going to be when you start off. So I wrote this book, and in my She Who Became the Sun, and all my friends were writing trilogies, so I pitched it as a trilogy. And in my head, it was always going to have 3 books. I knew what was going to happen roughly in each of the 3 books. And some publishers said, "Yeah, we're offering for a trilogy," and some people were like, "Duology? Duologies are hot right now. Why don't you do a duology?" And as it happened, I thought, I went with Tor. I love Tor. They grasped the vision of my book, but they were like 2 books only. I'm like, I don't know if I can do this in 2 books, which is why the second book is quite large. And the third act of the book basically could have been a whole book by itself. So structurally, this was an interesting adventure. I like to think I mostly held it together. Yeah, how to not make it rushed. I don't have any advice because I think the last third of my book is highly compressed, and could have had more room to breathe in a whole separate book. But on the plus side, you don't have to worry about the middle book sag. It's all you're all guns blazing right to the end. It's all ramping tension. There is no, that sort of managing the dip and the emotions and then up to a rise. Is just like straight up, which I think makes for a very intense reading experience, maybe too intense. Like the good thing about trilogies is you get more room to breathe in the middle. And yeah, and in a duology, you kind of don't have time for that. It's really like, okay, we're off to the climax, whether you like it or not. So,
As somebody who has written both trilogies and duologies, I completely agree with everything that you're saying. I feel like personally, my storytelling habits tend to form trilogies more naturally than duologies. Um, I'm kind of having this problem right now with my next young adult series, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, I think with this series in particular, Dark Gods, the endings of these books they're long. Excuse me. They're like parsed out. So like how I've structured each book is they all have 4 acts, and act 4 is always like basically the stuff leading up to the climax plus the climax. So a lot of it is very, I feel, stretched out. But I have seen some readers be like, wow, it was so intense and fast paced and blah, 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 like in this last like 50 pages. And I was like, okay. I mean, like I kind of want that feeling because from the beginning of the book, you're like, okay, getting immersed in the world, knowing the characters, okay, it picks up, and then once you get to the ending, it's like a baseball bat being like, enjoy the wait for the next book. So I don't think that my endings are rushed, but it's also difficult when you have multi POV because I think with some of the characters, some of their conclusions can feel a little bit rushed. So if you're working with multiple POV, I would suggest trying to like intersect what they're doing as much as possible in your climax. So like if they're working together or working against each other, even better. I think that's a great way to make sure that every character like has something that they're doing, and so that their ending in the book doesn't feel rushed.
In general, I think questions about pacing are always so interesting because everyone has such different opinions about pacing. Something that I might think is super fast or super slow, someone could feel the exact opposite about because I feel like we all have a different preference for how little or how much space a scene might need. Um, but I think for me, one thing that I focus on with endings, especially with something like this, which, the ending to book one obviously does not solve everything because there are 2 other books. Um, I make sure that the arc for that book in particular has come to a close. So in book one, you have the journey for a specific object. And even though there are other moving parts of the plot, and clearly there's more happening than just what the characters are experiencing on that journey, there's the promise of more. You still come to the end of that arc of that journey. So that is something that I focused on even with the second book. Um, you know, the interesting thing about second books, and one thing that is driving me nuts personally with writing a trilogy, is the second book. It has a lot of weight. There's a lot riding on the second book because you're balancing. You're basically ending an arc from the first book. You've had things foreshadowed in book one that have to come into play in book two. And then book two usually has its own plot line, like something that the characters are trying to achieve in book two. So that is its own plot line. And then you're foreshadowing something that happens in book three. So I think it feels like the only place where you're balancing all of the plot lines between these books. Um, and I think that's why maybe a lot of people perceive second books as being a little saggy because they have to do a lot. They have to carry a lot of plot. Um, so, one thing that I have been thinking about when I write this sequel is, have I closed out or have I given enough answers to the questions that were posed in book one? Have I given hopefully enough closure to like sort of like shut the door on those questions, but then open the door on more questions? So I'm kind of cognizant. I'm just thinking about those 3 different arcs. And like have I rounded out the things that I foreshadowed in book one? Have I closed out for the most part the sort of main conflict of book two? And have I foreshadowed enough of what's going to happen in three? It is so much to balance, which is why this book has been so hard, amongst other reasons. But yeah, endings are really hard. I think I have to edit mine very heavily because I like for them to be very snappy. I do a lot of like head hopping between the characters. Um, but again, it's not really until I get to the end, until I know exactly what the end point is, that I can go back and kind of iron out the pacing.
It sounds like a lot of like spinning things all at once. I'm not at all like good with my hands, so I can't get a better metaphor than that. But like a lot of things happening all at once. We have a specific question for Shelley because you mentioned your drafts or the first draft a little bit like a screenplay. You know, it's all dialogue. So people would love to know a little bit more about your drafting process.
Huh. It's a mystery even to me still. Like I said, I start with a very fixed plot framework, and that partially comes from the inspiration for the series, which is history. So I have a lot of fixed points. Although, like I said, I played with history a lot in this series, so the timeline is deeply compressed, but there are certain events that had to happen. And I had in my head already how those plot events would affect certain characters. So there are some monumental sort of moments that I knew I could not change. So I lay all of that out in an Excel spreadsheet. And then I write in Excel, which is ultimate chaos because Excel, oh, look at that sadness on Tara's face.
How?
It's
Shelley.
definitely
Shelley,
well, there
Shelley,
is an elegant way to do it in Scrivener with a little
are
like
you
timelines with the
telling me
little
that you
cards.
draft in Excel?
Yeah, I don't know. I just kind of because then you have a little column for each of your POVs. I've got 4 POVs, which is not as many as 8. And then you can see what's happening in each of the POVs because it lines up so nicely. And then you have all the historical events. So it forms a really nice grid. It's very logical. My only complaint is that Excel, you cannot make the rows of infinite height. So when you write a whole scene in a little cell, it starts to sprawl out. And that's when you know you have to move to Scrivener.
I can't.
So I actually have the full description of a scene in my head, but when I go to Scrivener, I write down the dialogue. I don't know why. I guess that's just the way my brain works. I guess that gives a structure to the scene. It gives the beats of the scene. You always want someone to change in a scene. Yeah, I guess my dialogue is always very functional. Like, yeah, I'm not a voicey character. It's not really about the voice. People are saying things to move things along, to have a realization happen in a scene. And like I said, the skeleton, and then it takes me forever to flesh out what you do in between the beats of the dialogue. I hate entries into scenes. I find that really difficult. So I tend to fall back on, because my book is Chinese drama influenced, there's usually a lot of beautiful scenes and settings. So I do the classic old, let's look at the scenery. The scenery is really beautiful. Let's use that as the entry into a scene. Yeah, and I haven't really mastered the whole, like all my scenes are very cinema influenced in that all the action is contained within a single scene. It never flows. Sometimes some books have this really clever way of breaking the action of a scene. They have a scene break in the middle of the action, and that really adds the tension. You'll be in the middle of a climactic fight or something, and then you'll cut the scene in the middle. And then it gives you that sort of, or the audience is like waiting, what happened next? And then you'll flow in the next scene straight on to the next part of the action. I can't do that. I guess I'm too influenced by TV or something. Like, anyway, I'm not very good at explaining my process, apparently. Yeah. But definitely you have to go back. I go back a lot, and then I'll see where the themes have popped up. I'll see where parallels are occurring, and then I want to strengthen that in various drafts. So write it and write it again and write it again. Dead-eyed stare, dead-eyed stare.
I love this question we got earlier, which was if you could recommend a book or series to your own characters, what would it be and why? I'll just wait for someone to jump in. I feel really bad with these ones that like take a little bit of thinking.
I know the answer to this one because someone said it in a review. Not a review, but they said, "Oh my God, your characters is 600 years before SSRIs were invented." I'm like, that's true. They all have mental health issues and they should be in therapy. They need all the books on therapy. They need The Body Keeps the Score, which is millennials' obsession with that book. A great work of I don't know, what is it? A book of like trauma therapy and understanding how trauma affects your body. All my characters should read this book, then they should immediately get a therapist and their lives would be better.
Can I steal that answer?
Right?
Just like I'm constantly thinking about this, about how if these characters, if some of these characters simply had therapy, things would not turn out as they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that would benefit so many of my characters. This is very general, but I also want to say anthologies. I have one character who is a storyteller, Mazen. And just because of the nature of oral storytelling, you sort of have stories and like these smaller tidbits. I think he would really, really love anthologies. I think he would like most stories because he is Mazen and he is excitable about stories. But there's something about anthologies, and I think the way the story is delivered and sort of these like bite-size bits, and short stories are a different beast, but they feel more similar, I think, to oral stories, to these stories that are passed down. So I would probably recommend anthology collections to him.
I feel like Tasia would really like Gideon the Ninth. Something about, their voices being a little bit similar. They love swords, they got muscles, they'd have a lot to bond over. I haven't watched it yet, but just from the general tone, I think Angelica would really like Yellow Jackets. And that's all I've gotten so far. Again, therapy, I think, is the best answer here. Yeah.
Okay, the last question that I want to ask, which is just purely always selfishly, I always love asking people how they refill their creative well, what they're, currently loving to kind of help, do that. And also about establishing a balance, between creativity and writing and work and also kind of your own like self, I don't know how to describe it, like your own self health. Mental health. I'm not really sure what I'm trying to go for, but like your own inner child, I guess. Kelsey, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I am on deadline right now this month. So my mental health is it's a little shaky right now. But I have been trying to treat myself to nice things just to, sort of get myself out of that headspace when I can. I tend to like to sort of take in media that is not book shaped or book form. I find that it helps to kind of like reset my brain. Today, I actually just went and watched the Spirited Away, the Ghibli film Spirited Away, on the big screen with my sister. And that was sort of my little break. But there's something about, watching movies, watching different forms of media, that is really inspiring. And I am also a book person. I like to read while I'm editing. But I think, it helps get me into a wordy mindset. But I think at the same time, it doesn't really help refresh my brain. But I do it anyways. Because like I said, it kind of helps for me to read something just to kind of be in that mindset. And then, when I'm trying to take a break from something, I'll watch something, I'll play a video game. Um, Right now I've just started Good Omens. So that has been a nice change of tone from what I'm writing. No time yet for video games, but I am hopeful for some time when I'm off deadline.
I also do lots of video games and watching stuff. I depending on the video game, I will make time for it. So I am also on deadline for book 3, actually. So my mental health is also pretty down because I think in some ways book 3s are easier than book 2s, but this specific book 3 is more difficult than my book too. So I really need treats as often as I can get them. So playing lots of Legend of Zelda, watching lots of anime, just like things that aren't quite, that are kind of like adjacent to what I do, you know, like with fantasy and stuff like that, but also just like tonally different, like what you were saying, Chelsea, or just kind of has something like very unique about it that kind of helps refill my creative well. Or if there's something that is like a little bit close, a lot of the times, like if I'm just like relaxing and like watching or reading something, there'll be just like a word or a sentence or something, and then my brain will start going off in a spiral until I'm like, oh, my character should do this in 5 chapters from now. And so because it's always like going on in the background even when I'm resting. So I think taking in other types of media is really, really helpful for that, for sure.
Yeah, same. But for me, it's not different types of media. It's different. I read a lot of nonfiction that refills my creative box. It's an entirely different type of wordage than, you know, reading epic fantasy. Like reading epic fantasy, like it's my genre, and you also get a lot of blurb reading as well. And then I can tap out. I gotta go to something else. I just really am a voracious reader of all sorts of different types of nonfiction, and I find that's where you get, I'm like a magpie. You pick up little bits from everywhere, and it sort of coheres into something exciting and new. So my bookshelf is full of books on like weird fungi and usually it's like nature and art type stuff actually that I'm into, or philosophy. Grabbing the closest book I have, art, monsters, unruly bodies, and women. So stuff like that gives you lots of cool ideas.
The cover is very eye-catching.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots of really upsetting pictures in there, which I really enjoy. I love art that gives you visceral feels, like especially if you're like, oh my God, I hate that. I'm like, oh, but why? You know, anything that provokes a response in me, I think is good. Yeah. And then also walking. Walking, very good to get the brain going. I always like a good stroll, solve all the problems that you've been like sitting at your desk for like a solid 8 hours. You're like, I cannot solve this problem. And I'll go for a walk to the gym or something. I'll be like, oh, it's so easy. You know, the solution just comes to me. So highly recommend.
I'll have to come to you for nonfiction recommendations. I like reading it. I enjoy it when I do, but I have a hard time finding like books that I really can like keep reading. Do you know what I mean? Because you know there aren't necessarily like series, you know, in nonfiction. So yeah, I'll have to pick your brain later for that. I did want to mention though that in the past when I've asked this question, I never have anything to offer because I have a really hard time with it. So I did want to share for anyone who is like keeping track. I am now watching a show about dinosaurs. So you know, for anyone who's been worried, don't worry. I'm watching some dinosaur stuff right now.
What's the show?
Is it the David Attenborough dinosaur
Yes.
show? It's surprisingly good.
Yeah, it's like CGI heavy, super heavy. It crosses the line. Have you watched a little bit of it, Shelley?
Yeah, I watched it with my kid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it straddles this line between like CGI and like planet Earth, basically. You know, like it feels very real in a CGI way.
But I have not been excited about dinosaurs since, you know, since the last 30 years, let's be real, since Jurassic Park. And I was excited again. It was like, oh, this is cool, actually.
Yeah,
So
and I'm not
did the
doing
job.
anything while I watch it. You know, sometimes you watch TV and like you do other things. This time, like, no, I have to see the dinosaurs. So yeah, I can recommend that one. Thank you all so much. I also wanted to say I've left everyone's like book links / you know where to find people's books in the description box below. So please check them out, pre-order them, and just be like enthusiastic about them as we all are. And I want to thank everyone for joining me. Thank you all for the chat and everyone's questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. And yes, thank you so much to the authors for joining me and chatting about all of these fantastic books and characters.
Thank you, Lily.
Thanks, everyone.